Hey everyone.
New year, new resources? Find out more on today's episode. I'm Judith Gutierrez,
And I'm Michael Lemus.
and this is Financial Paid.
All right. Well, welcome back. As Judith mentioned, it is a new year. We're in 2022, and we're very excited to actually be talking to our esteemed guest, Jake Brymner, who is our Director of Government Relations and External Affairs here at the California Student Aid Commission, or as we refer to him, our policy wonk, our budget guru. He knows all things on policy and on budget, which we, of course, need to stay up to date on. So we're very excited to go ahead and have Jake join us today.
Well, hello, Michael and Judith. It is so good to be with you both and to be here on Financial Pay. I have been a very eager listener of your first few podcast episodes, so really happy to join today.
I'm glad we get to have you on the show, Jake. We're always talking about this podcast, especially on all your team meetings with the Government and External Affairs team. Shout out to them. And it's such an honor to have you here answering some very important questions as we go into this new fiscal year here in the state of California. And so let's go ahead and start with just a general introduction. Who you are, what does the Government and External Relations team do at CSAC, and just a little bit more about your role specifically too and how you got involved.
Well, thank you so much. And I'll start maybe with who I am. As you mentioned, I'm the Director of Government and External Relations at the Student Aid Commission. And I think like you both, and we've talked about this before, financial aid is something really meaningful and personal to me. I was a student who benefited from the state's really generous financial aid programs back when I was enrolled, and my sister was also at CSU. So my family has personally benefited from this and the opportunity to get to give back and to help more students access those same opportunities that Cal Grant and financial aid can unlock. That is what really motivates me in my work that I get to do here at CSAC. What that looks like, to your point, and Michael, you kind of hit on it, especially this week with the governor's budget being fresh off the presses. A lot of that work is around looking at the proposals being put forth in the governor's budget or through bills that are introduced in the legislature and helping understand what that means for CSAC, what that means for our work in serving students and promoting affordable pathways to higher education for students across the state of California. And then increasingly, and as we'll talk about in a couple moments, I think, also looking at some of the new programs that have recently been established and helping our team understand what that means for how we're going to implement these new programs and bring them to students across the state in a way that provides the greatest potential impact for students. So like CSAC, we are a small but mighty team with a big mission and one that we are just thrilled as a government external relations team to get to do on behalf of the commission, but also all the students who benefit from the programs that our team at CSAC administers.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jake. And also our heartfelt thank you to you and your team for all the work that you do and helping us just to understand the budget, the policy. Sometimes when we first look at it or just look at a policy on paper, it's like, whoa, what does that all mean? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for students? And how do we implement all this? So that leads me into our next question, which you kind of already touched on. But with all these new financial aid policies, can you give us a quick recap of what's happening, especially in this new year, as you just mentioned? We got that proposal. What are things looking like for CSAC?
Well, last year was just such a tremendous year for financial aid and college affordability. And what we did through the state budget, we are still working to implement a lot of what happened in the state budget. But I'll maybe start with one of the pieces that we were just thrilled to see included last year and that we've already seen roll out to students across the state. And that is an expanded Cal Grant program for our community college students. You both have heard me talk about this before, but while our state provides the most generous state-based financial aid across the country, we know that there have still, up until this year, and still are persistent, some gaps that really affect how students can access financial aid based on their age, their time out of high school, or their GPA. That's work that we're still taking on here at the Student Aid Commission to address some remaining barriers. But what happened last year in the state budget was a really important change to make it so that if you're a student at a community college system, where we know, as Chancellor Oakley likes to say, they serve the top 100% of students, and many times students who aren't coming directly from a high school, They're taking a few years before they go to a community college. For the first time now, we can guarantee that if you're a community college student, you have an income that's eligible for a Cal Grant, regardless of the time at which you enroll and pursue financial aid, we're going to be able to consider them for an entitlement award and not have to consider them in what we call the competitive Cal Grant program, which always has had a very limited number of awards relative to how many students would qualify. So we are thrilled that this November, we were able to process the first round of these new community college awards. More than 100,000 additional students got a Cal Grant this past fall than they would have gotten without those investments that took place in the budget that was enacted in 2021. Our executive director, Marlene Garcia, likes to call that the Thanksgiving miracle, because we were able to pull this off pretty quickly and get those awards out to students in November after the budget was finalized in late July. So that was a tremendous new investment. There are so many new programs and expansions that were included in the budget. Probably that's a whole separate podcast series to unpack all of those. But what I will say is that there were two other new programs, one established to help support workers who were displaced from their employment due to COVID-19 and accessing new education or training opportunities and get reskilled or upskilled so they could get back into the workforce. We're working to implement that now. We also saw a new learning aligned employment program so that we could present paid work opportunities to students within their field of study. And then finally, and one that we're just so excited to help support this next year, starting in fall of 2022, we're going to have a universal approach to making sure that if you are a high school senior at a public high school in California, you can get assistance in helping apply for financial aid through the FAFSA or through the California DREAM Act application. You also have the opportunity to opt out, but we're setting this new framework for how high schools will work with the Student Aid Commission, work with other community-based organizations to make sure that that's something we're doing systematically and that we're not leaving money on the table that students can be claiming if they just get that help and putting in an application. So that was also something that got done in the state budget this past year. So as you can hear, a lot to cover, and I'm probably just skimming the surface.
Yeah, that is definitely a lot, Jake. And it's great to hear that we have people like you on the ground just handling all that and really, overseeing all the moving pieces. And I hope we continue to have more wins, because that makes the work we do that much more rewarding every year. I'm curious to know, are these new programs already available to students? What does the implementation process look like for this year?
Yeah, Judith, as I mentioned, the Cal Grants for community college students, those have been offered and pushed out to students who are eligible already this year. And one of the other really great things about the way that they made this expansion for community college students, and something we haven't seen yet, is that if you're a community college student, you're also going to have an opportunity to take your Cal Grant Award with you when you transfer to a UC or a CSU. So as long as they get this Cal Grant when they're at a community college, you have that guaranteed portability. We haven't seen the first round of new Cal Grant recipients start to transfer, so that'll be something we could look forward to later this year. The other pieces, I mentioned those two other programs, the Golden State Education and Training Grant Program for displaced workers. That program is one that we've been engaging new partners from the workforce training arena and workforce providers to understand how we can serve individuals who want to go into those programs as well. We believe that we're going to start to push out applications to targeted students who we think meet this criteria of having been displaced from work due to COVID-19. We're going to start to push out applications to those students in the next couple months here, and then do a pilot period to really understand how we can maximize the impact of this program as we're trying to help individuals across the state access those opportunities that'll help position them not just for an immediate job placement, but for a career as they're trying to look at what new opportunities exist in this, I want to say post-COVID, but we're not quite there, but in this new reality that we're all living through. We're also working with our campus and segment partners and employer partners to set up the Learning Aligned Employment Program. That program is one where the budget envisioned taking this year as a year to do planning, to understand how to set up the guidelines to implement this new program so that starting next year, in the 22-23 academic year, students can start to have those employment placements, start to earn a little bit of money, and most importantly, within a field of study or within an area where they have career interest, and hopefully positions them for a really successful post-graduation opportunity as they start to think about what they can do with their education in their career. So we're still working on that. And then the last piece I'll note, that new approach to helping our high school seniors apply for financial aid, that also takes effect this fall. So I know the three of us have been in several conversations about how can we use this podcast? How can we use other resources we have at the Student Aid Commission to help our partners at high schools and in other community organizations successfully take this on and help their seniors apply for financial aid?
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jake, for just, again, helping us to simplify the process, because it's not easy to understand. There's so many things happening. And with the pandemic, that's something I actually wanted to touch on. It's nice to see, especially from what you just mentioned, that there is a direct response to what students and just the public are going through in the midst of this pandemic. I mean, I would love to say post-pandemic, but like you said, Jake, things are still happening and we're still in the midst of it. But the state is responding and CSAC is responding. And it's very clear that just through a number of different initiatives that we're going to be able to help out a lot of different people, and the displaced worker program. And that's something that's so interesting. And a lot of people are talking about the shift in the workforce and what that's going to look like. And for our students or our high school students, I am just over the moon that is going to be a requirement for them to go ahead and actually have those applications filled out, and that the schools are going to be part of that process. And of course, us being CSAC, we're going to be very much a part of that process as well. But the educational tool and to have that opportunity, Judith and I have touched on just our experience with financial aid throughout a number of the different episodes on this podcast. And, there were some difficult and complex times, right? And we hear from other people that sometimes they just didn't know about CSAC. They didn't know about FAFSA. They didn't know about the California Dream Act application. So it's nice to know that this is going to be something that is required and instilled. And hopefully that means that they are going to be learning about these opportunities from very early on. And of course, we're going to be part of that process. So I'm very excited to hear about that. So with that all being said, while all this is happening, we also know that there's already a new proposed budget for the next year. So when it comes to that, what was included in that and how does it fit into the work that CSAC is already doing, but also with these new programs coming afloat, what does that look like?
Yeah, as always with higher education policy and delivering on financial aid, you're building the plane while you fly it. And we are continuing to roll out those programs that were just established in last year's budget. We know we're already talking to folks in the governor's team and in the legislature about the budget that's currently just starting its development and its process. So you're right, Michael, the governor just released his proposed budget for the 2022-2023 fiscal year. And there's a lot in there for higher education. What I'll start with, I guess, is really at the high level. The governor has set a new, really important goal for us as a state, which is to say that 70% of California adults should attain a certificate or a credential or a degree. Not only is that going to help us ensure that there's economic mobility for students across the state, regardless of what zip code they're coming to us from, but that's also a really important consideration as we think about the state's continued rebound economically from the challenges that COVID has presented, and making sure that we can continue to be what we hear so often from elected officials, the fifth largest economy in the world. And that is fueled by California's talent pipeline. So having this goal is just so important to how we orient our higher education systems. And in addition to setting this goal, the governor for the higher education segments has proposed multi-year compacts with goals for each of the systems, for the UC, for the CSU, and for the community colleges that will help us get to that 70% attainment goal. And a couple of those I know we're really excited about at the Student Aid Commission are trying to make sure that we close the equity gaps that exist between student groups, particularly for us at CSAC, this gap between students who have incomes that would qualify them for the federal Pell Grant, or those who don't and might have more family support as they go into higher education. And we know that that is one of the gaps that we can help solve for with financial aid and investments towards affordable college education. So what we saw in that arena in this year's budget was actually some follow through on part of the agreement and the negotiation between the governor and the legislature last year, where in the 2021 budget agreement, the legislature and governor said there are some investments that we're actually going to start in next year's budget around the middle class scholarship program, and actually even more funding for that learning aligned employment program that I mentioned earlier. Both of those were included in the governor's budget that he released. We also saw, and this is really important for the work we were just talking about around the new financial aid approach for high school seniors, is making sure that we have some additional staffing and resources to utilize at the Student Aid Commission so that we can help support our partners at the high schools and in the K-12 system as they take on this new role. So that's a really important investment to make sure that we can be there and that we can help our counselors understand how they can get those students to submit their financial aid applications, take all the questions that we hear about so often at CSAC, and provide students all the information they need to then know, okay, what is it that I'm getting out of this FAFSA or this DREAM Act application?
No, definitely. And these sound like major proposals for students and just college affordability policy. But I'm curious to know, what else is there that you and CSAC is envisioning on working on in the policy arena this year?
Yes. So if I didn't lay out enough already, and what we're going to be working on that the governor has proposed, we know that there are still some gaps in our Cal Grant program that we really want to address. I mentioned that we saw this historic investment and expansion in the budget from last year, which we were just thrilled about still. But there's a need for us to build on that success and make sure that we remove the other barriers that are still in between some of our students who might not have the traditional background and their financial aid. We also know that Cal Grant and financial aid are complicated. There are maybe 8 different kinds of Cal Grant, depending on how you want to count it. And all of those differ in how we identify students that are eligible as it compares to the new federal Pell Grant system that is actually going to start in fall 2023 when students apply for aid. So what we would like to do is continue the work of expanding and reforming the Cal Grant so that the systems don't have the same barriers that keep out students, that it's simplified and it's something that's easier to understand for students and families, especially if they don't have someone in the family who went to college already and they're one of our first generation students. We want to make sure that they can understand and predict their financial aid so they can make plans around it. And then we also want to try to align it with this new federal system that's starting in the fall of 2023, so that for the first time, you could look at one list and understand if you qualify both for federal financial aid and for the state Cal Grant program. So that's a big issue that we are going to take on this year in partnership with folks in the legislature and our student leaders who have really been at the forefront of this. The other piece I'll just mention really quickly, and the governor had a great line in his budget presentation around all the efforts we've made to cover tuition for students at our community colleges, the CSU or the UC. And that is a huge thing itself. That's the sticker price so many students look at. But we know that there are costs that go beyond tuition and that we don't always do a great job of covering all of those with financial aid. So the governor's line was, we cover tuition, it's free tuition, but free like a puppy. You love to bring that puppy home, but then you got to keep paying for its food and for everything else to, be a good fur parent. And what we would like to do is make sure that we're adapting our financial aid system to respond to those student needs, cover those non-tuition costs, and establish a system that's more understandable. While also looking at how do we connect students to resources like CalFresh, which traditionally has been really difficult for college students to access. And then that helps us get to covering more of their basic needs and dealing with those food expenses.
Thanks for that, Jake. The other thing that really just came to mind when it comes to just the implementation of all of this is that financial aid is continuously moving. And you said it already, Jake, it's time that we simplify it as much as we can. I mean, we talk about that all the time, that it's complex, that there's so many different forms of aid. I mean, students don't even know where to go and what direction to go sometimes because there's just so much going on. So yes, I'm a proponent for simplifying all of this, especially when it comes to just getting the access to these applications. What does that look like? I know there's also looking at some potential updates to the actual FAFSA itself in the future to go ahead and simplify the application, which is very exciting. But with that being said, what's the timeline? I know that some of these are just, of course, they're floating timelines. Sometimes things need to be adjusted, but what's the timeline? And a second part to this question is also, if people want to get more involved with this process or even just learn, what would you recommend?
Yes. So a lot of dates to hold in mind when you talk about the policy process. So we just started the work around the state budget. That is going to carry us through, usually it's June. There is a deadline of June 15th for the legislature to send the governor a budget. And between now and then, a lot of conversations taking place with folks in the Capitol, other partners who want to weigh in on where the state should prioritize its investment, and hearings that take place actually where the public has an opportunity to provide input to our elected officials around where should the state be putting its money, how can we best help our students cover the cost of higher education. So those hearings will be taking place February through June until we get to the final budget product that's the agreement of the legislature and the governor. And those hearings are a great place to provide input. There's public comment opportunities where it is always really encouraging to see our students showing up and providing input so that they're heard in this process. And they are the best position to be able to tell our policymakers what's going to matter for them in being able to pay for college and be successful. And a ton of resources too, I should mention, in terms of like, where can you learn about this? There's documents that are produced by the legislature, but also by the governor's team and the Department of Finance, where they really try to lay out pretty clearly what it is they're proposing, how much funding would go toward each of these different programs that are being proposed, and then also what that means for students. So the budget committees for each chamber of the legislature are going to produce those documents. The Legislative Analyst's Office produces more technical documents. Department of Finance lays out their proposed budget. And then last, I don't want to give a shameless plug here, we will, at our next commission meeting, be covering the budget proposals around college affordability. So we'll have some of our materials on this stuff too here at CSAC.
Thanks, Jake. And the one thing that I'll just throw in addition to resources is, I know Judith and I talk about this from a social media perspective, Twitter. Twitter is huge. I know for all of the budget updates, policy, all these hashtags get created. I like to joke around, but I am also serious about this. Jake is pretty popular on Twitter. And so there are a lot of resources. And, it's also a way that I even just get up to date when it comes to when the budget gets released. There are tons of people that are talking about it, LAO included, and different organizations. So it's a nice way to also just get a different perspective from a variety of different organizations. But yes, Twitter.
Twitter, Michael, you just totally nailed it. That is actually where I get some of my most breaking news about the state budget is being shared by budget advisors to leaders in the legislature. So that is a great resource and also a great way to be heard. If you're a student who wants to share what you're thinking about on higher education or really any topic that matters to you, we know that folks in public life are following all of that really closely. So yeah, that's a great suggestion there.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jake. It sounds like you and your team have your work cut out for you. And I say your team lightly because we are definitely right there with you as part of the external affairs team. And I am just looking forward to writing out the cycle with your team, following your guidance, and really just making sure that we are doing our best to advocate on behalf of students. To your point, to talk about basic needs, to talk about the total cost of attendance, total cost of living, and really start shifting that conversation of what it really costs to go to college. What does that price look like? Because times are changing. So very excited about this work. And I wanted to go ahead and transition us into one of my favorite parts of the episode. But we're going to do things a little differently today. We usually thank our speakers and ask them to have a great day. And then we go into our Mythbuster. But Jake is awesome, and he brought his own myth today. So we will be including our guest speaker today as part of our Mythbuster segment. So I'll go ahead and hand the floor over to you, Jake, to share a myth we hear from students.
So as a financial paid podcast listener, I feel honored to get to participate in this segment. But let me share what this myth that I'd like to bust is. And I think you both have seen this on social media in different ways and communicated slightly differently by students, but it usually goes something like this. Did Cal Grant or did FAFSA run out of money? the California Student Aid Commission is only giving out loans. What is it that I'm applying for with financial aid? Will there be money there when I apply? And that's a myth on a couple different levels. One, and this harkens back to the conversation we're just having about the state budget. The way we set the funding each year, we make sure that if a student is eligible for the Cal Grant, if they get their application in by the deadline, that's the real key, is make sure you get that application in before the deadline. You're going to get the Cal Grant if you're eligible. We will not run out of money in covering your financial aid award. And that money is grant funds, Cal Grant. It's not a loan that you have to pay back. So if I could bust a myth, it would be that we don't run out of money. It's not a pot of depleting funds where if you don't get it in first, you're going to miss out. As long as you get it in by that deadline, make sure you're following the deadline. And if you're eligible, we're going to make sure you get that grant.
That's awesome, Jake. And thank you for bringing that up, because yes, especially when COVID first hit, we noticed that on social media that people are like, do you even have aid? Do you have less? And again, speaking to what you brought up earlier, there's a budget, right? There's a budget that's presented every year that gets instilled. That's how we get our funding. And that's sometimes what people miss from the conversation, is they don't understand that process, and that we actually have these budgetary conversations way in advance. And to your point, that's what we want to keep pushing, is that we have grants. These are funding opportunities for students and their families where they don't have to actually pay that back. It's not a loan. And so thank you for bringing that up, because to this day, almost 2 years into this pandemic, people are still wondering, do you really have money available? We have an ad out there that says, we still have money, and people are like, do you? It's like, yes, we do. We're not lying. So thank you. And this is coming from our budget expert here, Jake Brymner, who is really laying it out that we do have this money. And in fact, over the last 2 years, we've gotten even more to go ahead and offer to our students in our community. So it's an exciting time to be in California for us to be able to assist our students and our families and the public.
Yeah, take the money. Just take it. I also, to your point, Jake and Michael, when I was in high school, I think, well, I'll explain the tactic, but a lot of what was said was, first come, first serve. There was that mentality from a lot of our educators. And I thought this whole time we're applying to college and applying for financial aid, it was the sooner you apply for FAFSA or the California Dream Act application, the more money you get. And if you apply late, there might not be enough money left for you. So I always thought, to that myth, I thought that was the case too, is that we're running out of money. So first come, first serve. But as I grow older, I think it was just a tactic to make sure students are getting those applications in time for that March 2nd priority deadline. But no, I'm glad we're able to bust that myth, that we do have money. As Michael mentioned, there is still money. Just take it. Leave the rest to us. Just take it. And I keep saying that, but it's so true. So thank you. Thank you again, Jake, for joining us today. Thank you for being a part of this episode. Thank you for all your work, and keep up the good work. Definitely let us know how we can continue to support. If you're listening in or watching, like and subscribe and share in your own networks and community. Continue to help us spread this word and this information, and get those college degrees, finish your vocational education, finish that post-secondary education. There are resources available, and we just want to make sure that you take advantage of them if you're a California student.
Well, thank you both so much for having me. I so much appreciate what you're doing with this podcast to get the information out there, encouraging students, just go get it, take it, if it's there for you, and giving me a chance today to share a little bit more about what we can expect this next year, and new programs we're setting up, and then more conversations that we are still having with folks here in Sacramento around the next budget. So thanks again for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you again, Jake, for joining us. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of Financial Paid. Judith and I are here to continuously remind you that the deadline for the state priority deadline for the FAFSA and the California Dream Act application is coming up quick. March 2nd is that deadline. So we really need you all to listen to us. If you're watching us, to really take into account our words, that it is so important to go ahead and get in that FAFSA or that California Dream Act application in order to qualify for the most aid possible. So as always, thank you for joining in. As Judith mentioned earlier, like, subscribe, follow, share our accounts, and get the word out about this important financial aid available to our students, their families, and our community.
Yes. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.